2021 marks the 7th centenary of the death of Dante Alighieri, who is well known for his work, The Divine Comedy, which is the greatest masterpiece of medieval Western and Christian literature. It is indeed a masterpiece because no poet of any language in any age has accomplished the same effect as Dante in his Commedia, where he presents readers of all ages and cultures with a panoramic description of the human condition that is at once existential as well as transcendental. Existential, as Dante describes with absolute realism, the profound impact that the many and varied situations of life, which are the consequences of choice and free will, have on the human psyche. Transcendental, as at the same time, Dante presents us with the optimism and the possibility of orientating that same free will towards breaking out of the narrow confines of such situations, enabling us to aspire and arrive at fulfillment and happiness. It is for this reason that the title of the work is Commedia, comedy, not in the sense of something to amuse us and make us laugh, but comedy in the sense of classical literature as something that, in spite of its many ups and downs, ends in happiness and joy. The full title of the work, however, is The Divine Comedy, La Divina Commedia. It is therefore at heart a religious work, and a Christian one at that. As one reads how Dante journeys through the three places which are cardinal points of Christian belief in the Middle Ages: hell, purgatory, and paradise. Indeed, the description of the human condition and its potentialities and aspirations and fulfillment in these places can only be understood and appreciated in the light of Dante's own experience of Christian faith and practice, which revealed to him that every situation and action of that human condition has a sense and a value that has been determined by God, and consequently can either lead us to find true happiness and fulfillment in God, or turn us away from God and make us exiles from that happiness and fulfillment for all eternity. At this point, perhaps readers who have no sympathy for any religion may decide to put the book down and not go any further. However, I would plead with such readers not to dismiss Dante's masterpiece so easily and quickly as something pious. It is that, admittedly, but it is also a record of something which Dante has in common with every one of his readers of every age and every culture, and that is the experience of life. Given this commonality of experience, Dante deserves a hearing from everyone, religious or not. And when one considers any aspect of piety in the Commedia carefully, one realizes that far from being sentimental, it is absolutely realistic. Dante is a poet, not a preacher. He did not write the Commedia to be a Bible tract or pamphlet for the purpose of proselytizing. He wrote it as someone who has gone ahead of us on a journey of life. And when one reads him in this light, one will find him more a companion on our own journey and struggle to find meaning and orientation for our own life. Indeed, when one considers Dante's own experience of life, the reader can find so much to identify with Dante. There was the experience of love, Dante's love for Beatrice, who was married to someone else and who died at a very young and tender age without appearing to have ever been aware of the ardor of Dante's affection for her. In spite of his frustration, however, Dante would go on expressing that love for Beatrice in his first work, the Vita Nuova. And after her death, he would find an outlet for his grief by intellectualizing that love in his second work, the Convivio. But it would only be in the Commedia that Dante would discover finally the meaning and reason for all the vicissitudes of his love for Beatrice. There was above all the experience of tragedy, which marked a major period of his life when his political career ended up in betrayal and exile from his native city, making him a homeless vagabond at the mercy of shifting political loyalties that made him ever so bitter and desolate. There will be many instances in the Commedia where we shall hear Dante venting his rancor on his fellow citizens for having failed him, castigating them and threatening them with retribution for their vices. There were, of course, moments of joy and happiness, and especially in the company of friends and fellow men of letters, as well as patrons who showed much warmth and affection, like Can Grande della Scala, the ruler of Verona, where Dante eventually serenely lived out the rest of his days. Dante will express his gratitude, affection, and admiration for them in the Commedia as well. All these experiences of his, Dante will embody somehow or other in his masterpiece in order to give the Commedia an element of realism, making it a very human work, in the sense of the Commedia breathing with humanness, which helps the reader to open himself gradually to the existence of other realities, the awareness of which would give fresh perspective on the reality in which the reader finds himself. And I hope that what I've said so far will motivate you who are hearing this podcast to read the Divine Comedy yourselves. The question has been asked, however, was it real? Did Dante really go through hell, purgatory, and paradise, as he says in the Commedia? It is hard to believe that he did, when several factors concerning its contents are considered, such as anachronisms and the structure of these places, which are excessively categorical and are not consonant with conventional Christian belief. For example, the layout of hell or the Inferno, it definitely corresponds to the systematic discourse on the virtues and vices in Aristotle's Ethics. Then there is the description of purgatory as a mountain, where an atmosphere of languid optimism prevails, and which contradicts theological opinions of purgatory in the Middle Ages as a pit similar to hell, where the torments are just as excruciating. Then there is the geocentric structure of the Paradiso, which is now obsolete since we know the sun is not a planet like the rest of the spheres in the solar system. These and many other factors do provide arguments against the authenticity of Dante's narrative. On the other hand, there are reasons to believe that Dante really did go through these places, especially when he describes the psychological impact traversing each stage of the journey had on him. Moreover, there are frequent allusions to actual geographical locations, as well as astronomical phenomena and historical personalities, all of which lend a dimension of reality to the whole work. Nevertheless, the answer to the question will always elude us. Perhaps also for this reason, there is a tendency to regard Dante as having a double persona in the Commedia. The persona of Dante, the pilgrim, journeying through these three realms, and the persona of Dante, the poet, who wants to communicate that experience of journey to us, but has to adapt the narrative to suit our capacity for understanding. To put it simply, Dante was more interested in us, in making sure that we understand him, rather than just describing his experience as it is, as he experienced it himself. To describe it as it is would not only render it incomprehensible to us, but perhaps repulsive as well, and thus fail to achieve the desired effect. Dante's objective in writing the Commedia, therefore, was not just to give an account of his experience, but to give it in such a way that the reader will be able to glean something from it that will assist him or her in the discovery of the truth which leads to life. It was precisely for the sake of communicating to his readers this truth which leads to life that Dante wrote the Commedia the way he did, which more often than not takes on the appearance of a magnificent and at times a somewhat fantastical manifestation of poetic artistry, as Dante makes use of every aspect of human existence and culture as material for him to work on to produce such a masterpiece. Music, astronomy, poetry, philosophy, theology, art, architecture, and even the social and political happenings of his time, all this will find a place in his great work. Although sometimes Dante may twist the facts to fit in with his objective. However, these external aspects of the work can distract us from perceiving the essence of the truth which Dante wants to convey to us, but which we may not be able to grasp because he presents it in such a complex manner. Let me explain. Truth. We are so used to understanding truth as something purely factual. If that is all there is to the truth, then we would be very impoverished intellectually. Let the facts speak for themselves, we say. And indeed, facts must be interpreted, their dimensions broadened, their depth of meaning to be sounded even further. And only then will perspective become more complete and the truth will be seen in greater clarity. It is this approach to truth that underlies the structure and content of the structure and content and contents of the Commedia, in which Dante will mention many people whom he encounters in the course of his journey, people who are actual historical personalities. Events too will be alluded to, events that did occur. If, however, that is all that they are in the Commedia, historical realities, then it would be difficult indeed to see how it can be relevant or useful to readers of a different age and culture. The desire to make his work perennially relevant was exactly the reason why Dante resorted to the use of allegory in his composition of the Commedia. Allegory was a literary device very common in medieval literature, whereby a symbol is employed to point out a reality which would have been too abstract to be understood and therefore needed the concrete aspects of a symbol, which instead of concealing or making it more obscure, actually uncovers a wealth of meaning hidden beneath the external experience of things. If we understand this concept of allegory, then we can also understand the contents and the purpose of Dante's masterpiece, which in itself is an allegory of the human condition, a drama that employs a sensational portrayal of peoples and places, not so much to entertain, but as an allegory to direct our attention and focus to higher realities, which are encrypted, so to speak, in the portrayal itself. An example of this are the personalities of Francesca and Paolo di Rimini in Canto 5 of the Inferno. They are real historical personalities, but Dante mentions them in that particular context to add another dimension to their characters, which is that of being symbols or figures of the inversion of love, when love is trapped in egoism and cannot go beyond itself. Instead of giving us a moral discourse on the subject of love that is distorted by egoism, however, Dante gives us a narrative of the fate which befell Francesca and Paolo and their present situation in the Inferno, where they are perpetually tossed about by a whirlwind that will never allow them to touch the ground. Dante tells us all this in order to give us a much more vivid account of what is actually an important moral lesson on the consequences of disordered love on the psyche. There are other examples as well, such as the characters in the Purgatorio and the Paradiso, all historical personages, but they are mentioned in a context that depicts them, for example, in the case of the Purgatorio, as personifications or epitomes of some vice that is being purged, or in the case of the Paradiso, the epitome of the fulfillment of some virtue that perfects the human condition. The most outstanding personalities, of course, are Virgil, the author of the Aeneid, who accompanies Dante in his journey through hell and up the mountain of purgatory, at the summit of which he vanishes as he yields his role and function to Beatrice, who will guide Dante through the 10 heavens until he arrives at the Empyrean. Much more than just a poet and the author of the Aeneid, Virgil is a personification of humanism, of all that is perfect in literature, philosophy, and morality that can help humanity to develop itself. And it is from these sources that Virgil draws lessons to enlighten Dante with knowledge and understanding to journey safely through the Inferno and the Purgatorio and the Paradiso, until he arrives at the Paradiso. Beatrice, much more than just a historical personality whom Dante idolized, represents grace, which is that power and strength which comes from God to supplement our own strength, which flags somewhat constantly in the face of risk and danger, and may therefore cause us to regress and not arrive at the goal and the ideal we are striving for. And so it is for every other character in the Commedia, which must not only be considered as historical, but as allegorical as well. That is, as embodying an otherwise abstract reality, which needs to find concrete expression in that portrayal to enlighten and inspire, and even to admonish us as to the truth of things. It is in this sense that one should read the Commedia. To all appearances, it looks something like a historical novel, and sometimes it is analogical to postmodern fantasy novels, and perhaps one could read the Commedia as such. But even historical and fantasy novels are written with a certain twist, so to speak. That is, not just to narrate facts or ideas, but to give insights into the inner world of its characters, insights into their thoughts, their emotions, their feelings, insights that only help to give a certain realism to our understanding of such characters. In the Commedia, however, Dante goes beyond describing this inner world of his characters to give us insight into their destiny as well, an insight which serves not just to make them real, but to let them somehow be pointers to us, to help us go about the business of living.